Working, test, test, test. Can everyone hear me in the back? Can I get a big old thumbs up? Nice, awesome, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. So first, let me just say a really big thank you to UC Irvine, to everyone organizing this event. Particular shout out to Constance, who invited me, and of course, Craig, who helped get me here and coordinate all of those details. It's a super big honor to be here. I really enjoyed all the talks yesterday, so if any of you are out there who gave talks yesterday, thank you, they were fantastic. And it's both invigorating and inspiring to hear just the depth of thought and the amount of clear reflection on esports as a cultural and deeply human phenomenon, which is something that is very near and dear to me, so thank you for that. Let's see, I think this clicker works. Cool, so my name's Kimberly Voll. I'd like to start with a big hello. You're welcome. Just seeing who's paying attention this morning. There's still coffee out there if you need it, it's cool. So you could say I've been studying people and games for most of the past 2 decades. I think I see myself ideally at the intersection of human nature and digital technology, in particular in games. My expertise sits in and around player psychology, including motivations and player-to-player dynamics, as well as artificial intelligence. So I like to say I do brains, both real and artificial. These are some of the hats that I've worn in my life. Obviously, as a player, I've been playing video games since the 70s. It's a long time ago. We had far fewer pixels. I've been a designer. I've been an engineer. I've been a researcher. I was a professor of computer science for many years. And most recently, as mentioned, I started my own studio. So I'm now trying on the hat of an entrepreneur. I spent roughly 4 years at Riot Games, leading up the player behavior and player dynamics initiatives. I was a principal designer there. And during that time, I helped grow and establish the craft of player dynamics as a design discipline within Riot Games and more broadly. I've published a lot of games as an independent developer. I have another company, Radial Games. It was my husband's and my small indie company where we released Fantastic Contraption was one of the more recent games that we launched for VR. So I've done a bunch of work in VR as well. I also co-founded the Fair Play Alliance, which is a cross-industry initiative spanning over 135 companies worldwide today that focuses on fostering healthy interactions and reducing hate and harassment as a core part of how we do game development specifically. And yeah, we're still working on our branding, but Stray Bombay Company is my new studio up in Seattle, Washington, focused on making cooperative games. So we're currently working on a 4-person cooperative game. Okay, so today I'm here to talk about video games, obviously. What I really want to address today, though, is how deeply troubled I am by some of the cultural problems that we're seeing in and around video games. I probably don't need to tell you that we have a problem in video games. We see hate, harassment, negativity, a deep lack of inclusion, and what seems like a systematic failure at multiple levels to do better. But I think we can do better, and part of what I want to talk to folks today about is what I think has gone on to get us here and what a path forward looks like to a better world. And I know this is a very mixed audience, everyone from academics to esports professionals to industry, development folks, et cetera. So I'm going to try to carve a path through there that hopefully has something a little bit meaningful for everyone. But to that end, I'll stay a little bit higher level. I'm happy outside of this talk to go deeper on any of these things. So please don't be shy to reach out and ask further questions. And we'll have some Q&A time at the end as well. So a lot of people play video games, a lot. You know, it is clearly a global phenomenon. It makes something in the order of over $100 billion annually. And we've got over 2 billion people playing around the world. So very popular. People like video games. But it's really even bigger than that. Games have actually become a defining part of society. They're crossing age and gender. And it's impacting not only how we spend our free time, but how we learn, how we connect, and how we understand ourselves. Games touch every aspect of our lives. They allow us to connect around the globe and transcend our very existence. And they seemingly help us realize our every dream, like the dream of being a pain in the ass goose. Games are magical because they're fundamentally human. You know, they reflect our hopes, our dreams, our fantasies. They're how we play, how we learn, how we find ourselves, how we connect. But we've got a problem. You know, this is a fairly benign example, but we've all seen this sorts of behavior, this persistent negativity that has woven itself throughout games, and of course spikes up into far more egregious offenses of hate and harassment and very explicit exclusion. And we like to point at companies and call them out for not doing better. You know, the company is toxic, players are toxic. And I think that that's not necessarily a fair accounting of what's actually going on. This is a very, very difficult problem to deal with. And that's not to say that companies and folks in and around video games get a free pass. Absolutely not. It's exactly the opposite. We absolutely can do better, and we need to do better. But just as I say that video games are an amazing reflection of humanity, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's the ugly that I really want to focus on today. So in order for us to move forward as an industry, as an organization, as a cultural zeitgeist, we need to have a deeper understanding of the mechanisms underlying this. Oops. So I don't think we're actually trying hard enough. I think that this is a failure of not just games, but of modern society. And there's really two key problems. One is it's not a big enough priority to address this problem. And even where there are teams and groups and whatnot doing really good work in this area, it's still nowhere near the level of priority that it needs to be. And when it is a priority, oftentimes we're not actually tackling the right problems. And so let me say a little bit about that. So you don't need me to belabor the type of problems that we're dealing with, but let me just say a little bit briefly about toxicity. This word really doesn't mean anything. It is bandied about as a colloquial term to refer to anything from the most egregious examples of hate to I'm slightly annoyed by something that happened to me that really isn't bothering anybody else, I'm just cranky. You know, all of that in between there is toxicity. So from a point of rigor, both within academia and within industry, I actually prefer the term disruptive behavior. And that's not meant to downplay the severity of what we're seeing. It's really just intended to flip it on its head a bit, and put the onus on us to understand the ways in which these are manifesting within the context of games. What is being disruptive? And this is a huge spectrum, right? As I said, everything from extreme hate and harassment to ambiguous behavior where it might bother me but not bother you, and vice versa, to just simply being annoying, to mimicking things that you've seen where you don't actually know they're hurtful terms necessarily, you've just appropriated language that you've seen, etc. So it forces this question of what it actually means to be disruptive and allows us to draw harder lines while still sympathizing and understanding a wider variety of player pain. And so crucially, this is a fundamentally human problem. And this is why I give some latitude to game companies. Because game companies have, for the past 40 years, been making games. And that's already really freaking hard if you haven't made a game before. And so on top of that, we're also adding, you know, all of psychology and sociology and anthropology and cognitive science and all that. And by the way, you gotta be experts in all of that too. It's super, super hard. But that's why we need this comprehensive, multidisciplinary approach to improving things, because we have now moved into the realm of cultural machinery that we all play a part in defining and changing. So let's step back for a sec and understand a little bit more, just briefly, about how we got here. First, mind-boggling. But that's one of the biggest problems that we're facing. When we think about traditional ways of doing game development, we think about the mechanics and designing the level and writing the narrative. We think about things like the pipeline and the process and publishing and all of those different things. And we do think about the people playing the game. But we haven't had a dedicated area of study that is understanding the implications of multiple minds in the same game, of the ways in which players interacting with other, both fully realize and fully break the intent of our designs and cause all sorts of other problems and meta-level problems. There's a lot of really great conversation about the meta yesterday, and one of the things that I think about when I think about the meta is the actual interplay of the people that themselves define the game, you know, this concept of genre-defining communities. So how do we take responsibility for that as a core part of design? This is what I think of as the discipline of player dynamics. So if we step back, in games we're really witnessing an inversion. You know, back in the day, we went to a place and there was a physical locality to playing games together, you know, either in the parlor or old board games, or as I'm more familiar, the arcade. You know, I grew up in the arcade playing games, you know, putting the quarter on the next machine and that whole culture, or, you know, when I was little, just wide-eyed watching somebody really crush it in a game. Or, you know, couch multiplayer as well. But what's happened is this inversion has led to us, rather than going to places where we have all the human fixins that allow us to relate to one another in a meaningful level, all of that now is being funneled into a digital space. And that digital space lacks all of those things that allow us to relate in a fundamentally human way. It is broken from the very start. It is a deeply impoverished space. We are no longer spending time together in the same way that we would spend time together in a physical space. And so socializing has become digital, and games are shouldering a large share of this burden. So I can give you a business case, but that's not what I'm here today to do. Critically, I think underlining all of this is the social responsibility for us to do better. You know, players deserve better. They need better. Our games need better. And they want better, you know, overwhelmingly. As I have working with the Fair Play Alliance, I've had the opportunity to talk with companies all over the industry, and overwhelmingly, players are all saying the same thing. They want better, you know, and not just players, but potential players, players that were players and were scared off, or players that are sitting on the wings waiting for an opportunity to play, that don't want to play games with other people because they know they'll be harassed, or at minimum, they'll be exposed to this persistent trend of negativity, and they don't want that in their lives. So it's much, much bigger. So underlying all of this is really a fundamental misalignment with the priority and value of this work. And I think what needs to happen is a more intentional stance in terms of how we address this. You know, we turn a blind eye often, and I say we in a very general sense, not pointing at any specific individuals, but as an industry, I think we turn a blind eye to othering or very exclusionary behaviors. You know, either because we're conditioned not to see them, which is terrible, but its own flavor of problem to address. We don't know what to do about them. You know, I've spoken with tons of companies that see it. They think it's awful. They're deeply aligned with the values of a world where that doesn't happen, and they're not prioritizing doing anything about it because they have no idea what to do about it. You know, that alone was the biggest genesis behind starting the Fair Play Alliance, was can we curate and create the best practices, bundle them up, and just hand them free of charge, and work with game companies to be able to pull these practices into their day-to-day work. You know, and sometimes it's just this predominant sense of, I just kind of wanted to play a video game. Why suddenly am I pulled into this deeply troubling quagmire of human complexity, right? I didn't sign up for this. And the worst of all is sometimes we celebrate these behaviors, you know? They're kind of funny sometimes, and so we laugh, and that propagates it, and that sends a very strong message that this behavior is actually okay. So we promote folks to celebrity status because they're funny or they sell tickets, without adequately weighing the cost that this has to the health of the game or players, or the larger cultural implications. You know, we claim all sorts of fears like hug boxing or starving the games of what we love. We fail to talk about what diversity and healthy interactions actually bring to the game. You know, we have a lot of excuses. And they're just that, they're excuses. These are not valid legs to stand on. So let's very briefly talk about some of the misinformation that's sitting out there that I think is getting in the way. And then we'll dive in a little bit more deeply to some of the mechanisms that I think are really, really driving this. So any kind of superficial misinformation gets in the way of actually digging in and understanding the problems of what are driving these forces, and then by extension inhibits our ability to change our design and development processes to better address those problems. So one of those is this concept of anonymity. And I'm sure if you haven't said it yourself, you've heard somebody say, well, the big problem is it's anonymous, right? I see a lot of nodding, right? It's anonymity. I don't know who's there, or they don't know who I am, and that gives me permission to be a total jerk face. So that's actually misleading. That's not actually what's going on. Anonymity is more a correlation. The problem is actually a lack of social consequences. And the reason it's not explicitly anonymity is partly because, or that we can be confident knowing it's not just anonymity, is partly when you look at other examples where people are misbehaving. So not to pick on our friends at Facebook, but take a look at Facebook. All sorts of stuff goes down on Facebook where you know exactly who that person is. You might know they live down the block from you, and they're still doing these things, right? So it's not strictly anonymity. And we see plenty of other examples of that behavior, people on streams and whatnot, where people are readily identifiable, and they're still showing these hallmarks of misbehavior. So it's not that it's irrelevant, it's that we can't just point to it and go, well, fix that and we fix the problem. We need to stop doing that, it's a distraction. We need to understand social consequences and the larger social ecosystem that we're dealing with. So how are we failing to connect within digital spaces? So we also need to stop creating artificial divisions. Okay? Online is real life today. There might have been a time where it was practical to differentiate those spaces as one being real life and one being a play space, maybe. But that is not true today. They are different, but by putting it in its own bucket of, well, that's not real life, this is real life, that gives us a free pass to ignore the problems that's going on here because somehow they're less valid, they're less worthy of our time and investment to make it better than these ones over here, IRL. So we need to stop that. So step one, we need to understand what's happening. And this is kind of the big call to action. So I've said already several times, we need to understand better how people relate. That's where we need to put the focus points. So there's really a few different ingredients. This is, there's tons of research behind this. There's all sorts of things that feed into this. But there's really kind of 4 big things that I think would be useful for us as an industry and beyond to think about more, which is how we foster meaningful relationships and establish trust. So the first is proximity. And that can be digital proximity or literal proximity, as in we are actually in the same spot right now. So it kind of is obvious to have a relationship of any flavor with someone, you need to have some way to be in their proximity. Similarity gives us what we call the fluency effect. So having some degree of similarity with somebody makes it easier to communicate with them. It means you're more likely to have some shared ground, even if it's a shared communication style, a shared love of a game, etc. You have something that allows that connection to start. Reciprocity is the give and take that we have as human beings. So if you're having a conversation with somebody and you nod at them, if you hold up your hand and somebody high-fives you, this is reciprocity. This is you as an individual putting out a bid, asking for somebody to reciprocate. And when they do, that germinates a little bit of trust. And the final one is repeat exposure. So you need to see folks more than once. You might have a great moment in an airport as you're passing through and then never see that person again. Well, you didn't establish a relationship other than that ephemeral moment where you had something special happen. So we want to establish relationships and create the conditions for trust to form on behalf of players. So we need to create more opportunities for them to see each other and get to know each other slowly, gradually, more like how we actually do as human beings. Much of what we're seeing is fundamentally a trust failure because we either have very impoverished communication spaces, for example, that don't allow folks to relate. So if you think about how you have a conversation in most online games, it's often in the context of a high-pressure situation where you're not likely to take the time to really explain yourself. It may be across cultural divides or language divides where communication styles are themselves fundamentally different. It might be mediated through a keyboard with a lot of other stuff happening where there's no guarantee that your point is going to be realized. There's lots and lots of ways in which our communication systems in games are deeply impoverished. We have a lack of identity. We have profiles and avatars that really do very little to belie who we are as individual people. And of course, overriding all of this is a thoughtfulness around privacy. But I think we can't hide underneath that either. We need to be more thoughtful around how we put the agency in the hand of players to create more opportunities to connect and reveal themselves more gradually when they're comfortable doing so, and have processes and policies in place to help protect against bad actors in that space. But we don't have great ways to relate. We have weird names that don't make any sense. That even if I do see you again, I'm not going to remember who you are. We do matchmaking pretty much universally either, if it's not warm body, it's matchmaking based on skill. But we rarely ask the question of what it means to be compatible. Skill, while valuable in the realm of competitive integrity, and we don't want to undermine competitive integrity, certainly not in competitive contexts, but while valuable, is not a really great predictor of the quality of a match you're going to have with someone. If I show up all ham-boned and I'm goofing around in a game and you just want to get down to business and play this game, we're going to clash. And that's not because either of us have done anything wrong. So how do we actually lift up and understand compatibility? I don't think we understand it today. When I put this question in front of many folks who work on matchmaking systems or are thinking about multiplayer games, most folks don't have a really good idea. They'll say things like, we need social matchmaking. What's that mean? I don't think we know. So I think we're starting to sniff around this space, but we need a concerted effort to get in there and understand what are the actual vectors that are meaningful for creating healthy, successful matches between players that aren't just skill. Skill might inform that match, but it shouldn't be exclusively skill in the broader spectrum. And so related to that, this concept of mismatched expectations. We end up oftentimes having two very valid interpretations of how a game is going to go thrust into the same environment and expected to get along. These are when I say at the beginning I don't like the term toxicity, this is one really great example. Somebody coming in with expectation A, somebody coming in with expectation B, fundamentally incompatible, now calling each other toxic. Well, nothing about that is actually toxic unless the behavior starts to devolve. Maybe then it starts to go down a particular path. But there was something there that we as developers should be doing a better job to protect against, or at the very least, create more opportunity for players to opt into the kinds of experiences that they want to have. We do a very light touch version of that by having game modes, but it's nowhere near enough. So we need to understand this. We need to research it more. We, as a society, have very low resilience, particularly in digital spaces. The concept of giving the benefit of the doubt, of acting with grace and assuming the best intent. Yeah, that all goes out the window when you're online. And partly because of all of those things I've just been talking about, you don't relate to one another. Think about the person that cut you off in traffic, right? You're like, right? But if you realize, oh, they're your coworker, you're like, oh, man, I bet they're having a bad day, right? Our opinions of people are deeply affected by how close they are to our inner circle. And we're super, super inconsistent and contradictory. Humans are, we're terrible at this stuff. So we don't have really good resilience, which means when things do go awry in the context of the game, we're much more apt to lose our cool. And now that's compounded by really poor communication tools, et cetera, et cetera. So it just keeps getting worse. We're super biased. We're really biased against strangers, riffing off of what I just said. We naturally default to an us versus them mentality. It's efficient for our brains. There's a lot of information coming in, and you need to know whether that saber-toothed tiger is going to eat you or not. You don't have time to buy it lunch and get to know its motivations. We also, for similar reasons, suck at scale. Scale pushes us to the very limits of how we're able to imagine our world and think of what and who is safe in that world relative to us and where we're comfortable. in games, we blow that scale out. We're always talking about bigger is better, 100 million people play this game, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't want to go hang out with 100 million people. Games for me are a very personal experience. They're a place I go to feel safe. And I don't feel safe when I'm standing in a crowd of 100 million people. I don't even know what that looks like. That's a lot of people. So how do we create spaces that are more reflective of where we as humans naturally feel more comfortable? That starts to unlock that benefit of the doubt, that more grace in behavior, et cetera. And we also mimic what we're exposed to, and we're seeing this at scale as well. We've normalized poor behavior, right? That's just games, right? You just got to toughen up. But we're actually hiding within that a deep survivorship bias. The folks that are left in games are the ones that are willing to put up with it or have gotten so used to it, or that is their preference. But that's not really the world that we want to be in. So poor behavior begets more poor behavior. It just forms the habit. So in short, to bring it all together, we're really not prioritizing the human needs component of how we think about game development and all of the events and things going on around that. I really like these impossibly beautiful people gathered around sharing a single smoothie. I don't know, I Googled social. So social is really every aspect of how players relate. Too often we think of social features as being, oh, we added a friends list, cool, we got chat, done. It's a deep oversimplification of how we actually need to think about it. Any way in which your players relate to one another, unless they're operating in complete isolation and never cross paths, guess what? It's social. And so we need to think about social design as a core part of how we create games and experiences and competitions and all of the meta as well. So step 2, now that we've got very high level, we don't have a lot of time, but an understanding of what's going wrong, this lack of prioritizing human needs and the ways in which the games that we're creating are not meeting those needs, how do we actually go ahead and apply that understanding? So this includes all of us, right? Developers, researchers, casters, event organizers, everybody involved in this industry. Well, people do the things that they do in part because we create the conditions that drive that behavior. But we don't hold ourselves accountable for creating those conditions, right? We're very quick to just kick that can down the road and be like, well, you had a choice in how you behaved in that game. You made that decision. But even if that were true, that doesn't lead us to an improvement. That doesn't lead us to, I don't want to use the word solution because there are no solutions, right? We're trying to create a series of changes that better support us as a society, right? So even if you kick that down the road, how does that actually help us start to be thoughtful around the things that actually frustrate players, for example, or create opportunities to develop that resiliency? So we do need to hold companies accountable, but not for having humans in their game, which is kind of where we're at right now, is you have bad players in your game, you're a terrible company. That's not realistic by any measure, right? You're always going to have people in a game misbehaving, sometimes terribly, particularly at the scale in which games operate, and all of those things I just talked about, clashing cultures, all of these different things. So yeah, we got humans in our games. That's also what makes them awesome. The thing that we need to hold companies accountable for is working to foster pro-social behavior as a core process. That's what we're not doing for the most part across the industry. Or when we are, there's teams that are fighting their asses to get their work prioritized and having it deprioritized because it's not seen as an integral part of how we do game development. Like, well, we could do this pro-social feature, but then we'd have to cut this other feature, so it won't make as much money, so we should cancel that feature. That's the kind of priority decisions that are happening, is we're not able to bubble up the true value of why this actually matters. And there is a business case, right? There's a business case and there's a social responsibility case, and there's a ton of stuff in between, but we're not repping it very well. And we need more research, which I'll get to in a moment, to help us unlock those conversations. So this is cat food. I don't know. I searched healthy by design, and apparently there's a brand of cat food called Healthy by Design. So So how do we do healthy by design other than make a brand of food called that? I guess we could have like gamer fuel and healthy by design fuel. Well, we need to look at not just punishing and not just thinking of this as a problem that we deal once it's happened. Because once it's happened, we've already missed every opportunity to prevent it. And now we have players that have been actively hurt by this. We hurt the industry by just dealing with punitive measures on the other side. Now, we need those too, right? Like I said, humans be humans. Stuff's going to happen. We need to always have clear, consistent consequences and do our best to continue to work toward clear, consistent consequences, which itself could be its own talk because that's so difficult. But we need to be looking up ahead and change the way that we actually make games and we make events surrounding games that foster healthier interactions. And there's growing resources in this space. A quick plug for the FPA. This is one of the things that we're trying to do. We just had our first official event symposium in Europe last week, where we were bringing together experts in the space to be able to share what they've been working on. And we're going to be publishing white papers and doing more of that. But there's a ton to do. And there's 135 companies, and we're a small volunteer organization that's driving that. So we're trying to get out there. We have a GDC official track now that is the Fair Play Summit. So there's opportunities for these things to bubble up. But we need everybody here to be sharing your work so that we can amplify that, and amplify it in other places as well, not just through us. So here's some examples of what this can look like in action. If any of you have played that game company's mobile game, Sky, it's a really interesting exercise in what happens when you fuel an entire game around a premise of positive interactions. So it's really social at its core with an emphasis on the positive. You can hold hands, you can hug, there's a range of other emotes, the social language of which is fundamentally positive. And this makes the collaborative portions of the game really sing, because they set expectations for behavior. They define the very sort of tapestry of the game. They imbue it with a positivity, which changes the very way we interpret what's happening in a game. So you can get very, very positive experiences. Now, that isn't going to work in a cutthroat MOBA, for example, right? And so this is, again, why disruptive behavior is a useful term. What's disruptive here is not necessarily disruptive in another context, right? If I tackle somebody in golf, that's disruptive. It's not disruptive in football. Another really great example, I think, leveraging reciprocity of something that could seem to be gratuitous, but actually is a powerful system, is in Sea of Thieves. If any of you have played it, you might have noticed that if you play an instrument and somebody else on your team plays an instrument, what they've done is made it possible so that those instruments now are playing a song together. And so you naturally become part of a band, which who doesn't love being part of a band? So that might seem gratuitous, right? I mean, the game's about being a pirate, and you don't hear the big tales of pirate bands. It's not necessarily a huge part of the pirate zeitgeist. But that thoughtful feature actually added something that created an opportunity for reciprocity to take place, which means the players that are experiencing this are actually unconsciously, if not consciously, developing a greater affinity to their teammates. And so the rest of the game becomes more positive. So these are the kinds of things that if we're thoughtful, we can do more with. There's also the concept of policy. I said earlier, when we have a tighter definition, this also allows us to take a firmer stand. And policy is one of the ways in which we can realize this. Designing policy is not unlike, in many respects, aspects of game design. You want to be thoughtful about humans, what humans are trying to accomplish, where you put those rails, where you put that wall, et cetera. And policy is a very similar sort of system, but one for sort of like the broader society. And this really helps not only players, but it also helps empower designers and frontline folks, because this allows us to align around a shared articulation of a value system too. So when you think about a larger company, or even just the distance from, writing the first bit of code to player support down the line when things are live, that can be a huge gulf, right? Either because your company's big or just time or all sorts of different reasons, the mindset that goes with both of those things. But if you're thoughtful around the values that you want to bring to your game, Policy can help you equip the folks at the front line when a game is live with an understanding of those core values and an ability for themselves to act with agency in the face of those core values, while similarly aligning around a shared pillar of expectations at the design level too, and communications and all of those different things. Because that inconsistency, when you have inconsistency there, can undermine really good work and really good intentions. So I said I'd come back to this notion that we need some research. So what kind of research? I mean, obviously all the work being presented here is amazing and I think contributing in really positive ways. Here's some specific things that I have seen bubble up through my work with Fair Play Alliance and beyond. I think one is rigorous measures of disruptive behavior. We need to quantify it, and it's not a super quantifiable thing. But in order to win over hearts and minds and funding, we really need to be able to say, X and Y is bigger or smaller depending on which direction you're going, and that's a good thing by X percentage. So we need to have some way to do that. Companies are trying, but they're measuring toxicity. And so I pose the question to the room, if I brag about a 30% increase or decrease, in toxicity, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, right? I mean, it sounds great on paper. Somebody might throw me some money, sure, but I don't actually know what's happened. There's so many confounding factors. Is it just that people aren't reporting as much? Well, are they not reporting because there's less stuff going on in game, or are they not reporting because players have established that we don't do anything about those reports, and so they've lost all trust in the system and reporting went down? Oh, right? Am I measuring the actual, egregious offenses of hate with intent? Or am I measuring some kid mimicking the language that they've heard in other contexts that they didn't even realize what it meant or its deep historical significance, and they're just parroting it back because their friends said it and they want to be cool and they want to fit in? Sure, on the surface, you don't want those things in your game regardless of the source, but how you address those two issues is very different. Because if you just say, well, we just want to ban all of the bad actors, guess what? There's not going to be many people left. Right? That spectrum, we need to dig in and understand it more. So we need to find out a better way to define these different types of behaviors so that we can meaningfully quantify them, or at least do our best to create a way to discretize and abstract that into something that we can count and we can look at before and after. And that includes also when we're querying players as well, too. No player, if you say, do you want less toxicity, is going to go no for the most part. I mean, they might ironically, but some people want to watch the world burn, sure. But everyone's going to take that word and interpret it through the lens of their own experiences and go, yeah, I want less of the things that bother me. Okay, well, now we've created almost a universal truth, so we're not getting information out of that. And that is literally some of the work that I see being done on player surveys. So we need to do a lot better, and we need to get to a spot where we're measuring the impact and efficacy of our interventions so that we can actually create a proper cycle of improving as an industry. We need to stop encouraging poor behavior. We need to change the tacit and explicit ways that we encourage behavior. Don't reward it. When you laugh or chalk it up to just being part of the game, you make it okay and you set that example for everyone else. We need to stop defining games by their poor behavior and define them by the game. That's why we're there. We set clear rules of conduct as early as possible, but we also ourselves need to be willing to change on behalf of players. And we need to work with pros and casters and developers to ensure that these values are effectively communicated in a way that is actually resonant with the game. We can't just one-size-fits-all approach to all games. There's a variety of players with different needs, with different expectations, games that do well with different types of behavior, etc. There's some stuff that I think we can start to align on around, hate, etc. But generally speaking, we need to have more nuance. And we need to make sportsmanship a first-class value. We need to celebrate this as a first-class value alongside skill and the other things that make a game great. Right now, this is seen as a nice to have. If somebody does something nice in a game, it might get called out. But at the end of the day, it's winning that's what matters. We don't necessarily do better about this in traditional sports either, to be fair. But we need to make respect and non-harassment part of competitive integrity. How do we get there? Well, I mean, ask yourself how allowing others to treat each other, or how allowing others to treat each other like crap upholds the spirit of the game that we play. I don't think that's a definitional part of what we love about all of the amazing competitive games in the esports scene. And equally, we need to work across games. You know, we like to say at the Fair Play Alliance, a rising tide floats all boats. We have to change fundamentally as an industry and as a culture if we're going to actually make meaningful change. If one company or one competition just pushes out in one way, I mean, they might make some headway, but they're just as likely to be bowled over by the momentum of the rest of the larger industry. So how do we actually start to change together? Well, I think we share. We share what we're doing. We share our expectations. We talk about what good looks like and what good doesn't look like. We talk about the things that players are saying, hey, don't change this. This would ruin our game, and understand why that fear exists and whether or not we should honor that, or if it's just really more of a fear of change. We need to understand more about the implications of poor behavior on our games, but also set higher expectations for what good looks like in performances in the professional scene. And lastly, and this is a really big one, we need to actually teach the next generation how to do this. You know, we grew up in a fairly non-digital society for the most part. You know, I was born in the 70s. I was lucky to be exposed to computers at a very young age, but I certainly wasn't playing online. And, you know, with that sudden swing in the last 10 years or so of us going online, that hasn't allowed the time for us to evolve the sort of protocols and normal things, mechanisms that we would have for relating to one another, as I've talked about at the beginning. You know, we're not meeting those social needs, partly because we're scrambling to catch up. But it's not just the games themselves not providing adequate opportunities. We're also not training the next generation to understand what good looks like. You're not just born into being a good digital citizen. There's a lot to learn to understand how to conduct yourself in those environments. And sure, some folks might naturally be good at that. But typically speaking, as humans, we're not really that good at these things. So how do you actually teach kids how to interface healthily as a part of digital activities? And, you know, esports as well for schools that have esports teams. You know, the best place to learn digital citizenship and foster resiliency is actually in the schools. And we need to invest in schools in equipping teachers with the ability to teach this, to understand this, because still we're in that spot where many parents and teachers do not understand, you know, they don't speak the language of video games. They don't understand the value or even what their kids are getting out of those experiences. They see them as isolationist activities rather than this blossoming social zeitgeist that is taking over the world. So how do we actually equip parents and teachers, first, with an understanding of what games are, and secondly, with the tools and opportunities to be able to turn these into more teachable moments and grow with their kids, so that when kids are growing up and playing the next generation of games, you know, graduating into the older kids' games and beyond, they're coming in with a deeper sense of digital citizenship as a foundation. And that, again, starts to create where bad behavior begets bad behavior, good behavior also begets good behavior. And so we start to change the fundamental qualities of these spaces in a very long-term fashion, you know, a way that really is much more sustainable in terms of change. And to that end, if anyone is interested in working with schools, I've done a lot of work in that space myself. When I was at Riot, we ran a very successful pilot in Oceania where we partnered with schools and the government to create core curriculum on behalf of teachers. And that program is still running today. So if you're interested in what that can look like and what we can do to give back in a way that is actually informing a healthy cultural change, I'm happy to talk more about that. But I mean, let's face it, change is hard. You know, to bring this all around, it sucks to have to change. Video games are a place that has welcomed many of us for a very long time. You know, many more, you know, the 2.2 billion folks around the world. And what we're really pointing at is a pretty fundamental change in terms of how we think about what games are and what good looks like. And we really need to be able to think about this from a perspective of change management. Because when your identity is tied into the very games that you play, asking that person to change is a fundamental attack against who they are as a person. And so that doesn't mean that all behavior is okay and, well, I guess we just have to forgive it. But it does mean we have to be thoughtful about how we usher in this change. And this applies to us as well. Our own biases are coming into play here just as much as everyone else's. So there's this multi-layered sort of, here's what's happening in the play space, and here's what's happening, for everything, all of that meta surrounding it as far as the industry, development, events, et cetera. Our brains are hardwired to resist change and convince us that it's fundamentally wrong. So we need to support ourselves, support each other, and create more rigorous ways to say what good looks like so that we can at least shake off some of that bias towards the pursuit of a better future on behalf of players. So let me just kind of pull this all together and say I'm not picking on any one company, any one organization. I want to remind everyone this is very much a cultural problem. Games have grown beyond our wildest expectations. They are now a fundamental way in which we relate, connect, and communicate with one another. They are a space, as abstract as it is, where we go to spend time and where the next generation is spending a lot of their time forging their lifelong friendships and beyond. And so if we don't start to address this as a fundamental cultural problem that we all share a responsibility in making better, then we are going to stay stuck exactly where we are. And I at least don't want that to happen. Thank you. So we have time for questions. Should anyone have a question? We can wrap early. I'm easy.
If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring the mic around.
Yeah, also I'm blind, so trust these guys to get the mic. Oh.
I tried Googling you, and I couldn't find you. What is the best way to contact you or read more about your work?
Yeah, I'm happy to share my contact info. I can share my contact info after this. You can reach me on Twitter at ZanyTomato as well. Yeah. Yeah, being a female in this industry, I'm a little reticent sometimes to broadcast some of that contact info. But this is a safe space, so you guys can all have it.
Hi, good morning. Jerry Gomez, Fresno State. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Just how we have the Myers-Briggs and all those psychological assessments. Mm-hmm. Do you know of any gaming assessments that are out there that would tell us more about how to understand our players and how they engage in the games? How can we maybe understand them better?
So there's some, slipping my mind at the moment, there's some work around motivational structures over the last 5 to 10 years that I'll have to look it up and I can follow up with you, but because it's slipping my mind. I just got back from London, so I'm still a little jet lagged, I apologize. But that's looking at how we can break into groups the underlying things that drive players. So there's things like, I like to collect things versus da-da-da. So I think that's a good, meaningful start. I think player behavior subgroups is actually a really meaningful pursuit. That's actually what my talk in London was understanding the ways in which we can partition and repartition groups to break away some of that bias and create an opportunity to find motivations that are driving players that we might not traditionally think of because they don't match our motivations for playing or our company's motivations for playing, et cetera. So I think there's some groundwork that's starting there. I think that is an excellent example, though, of needing a much more rigorous approach across the industry to understand not just local motivations for playing, but how does that bleed into the social needs of our player base as well, and at a community-like scale as well. What are the mechanisms that drive a community to kind of form around things, and what does that look like, and how do people fit into that broader community outside of just the game itself?
So I think on that theme, and early on you were talking about the traditional games and the physical space of those and people playing together, physically together. And then now, with all the tournaments that are happening and people being in, whether it's arenas here or in stadiums, how much do you think that aspect of people actually being physically co-located, either as participants, as spectators or players, may help this evolve in a good direction or a bad direction?
Yeah, I think that's an awesome observation. So I think it helps a lot. I think that again, co-location is a really powerful tool. When it's at the scale of a huge stadium, it's not quite the same. But the interesting thing about humans is you push them into a broader scale and they naturally just form smaller things. And that's that mechanism of us versus them driving, right? So if you're at a huge event with, I don't know, a gazillion folks, you might make friends with the few people in your row right beside you. And so there's that nice forcing function that I think is really powerful. And if those are really diverse sorts of events, then that can actually transcend a lot of the difficulties that we're seeing. The problem is that while that works in those settings, and I think should be a core part of a broader approach to a bunch of different things, it's not enough. One of the things that makes games so great is that they close gaps around the world, and not everyone has the means or opportunity to travel to those events. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think additionally, we need to be focusing on digital ways to recreate some of those and understanding the ways in which digital spaces are failing to recreate those right now.
Hi, thanks for your talk today. I really appreciated what you were saying about the fact that the problem isn't anonymity, and that it's in the fact that there isn't a lack of, or that there isn't social consequences. So I'm curious if you can give some ideas of particularly how practitioners might be able to create social consequences that don't result in the us versus them mentality, and perpetuates individuals feeling like social outliers instead of part of the community.
Good question. It's really hard because a lot of times there's this tension that exists between sort of the name and shame versus a gentler approach that might allow somebody to self-reflect, and it might work, but it also might trigger reactance where somebody just digs their heels in and refuses to change, and so now you are in a situation where you kind of are forced in some cases to exit that person from the community, versus a gentler approach that allows them to change and grow. And I think that the gentler approach is what we typically see in day-to-day society, face-to-face, where you have, if you say something kind of inappropriate, I can sort of give you a little signal like, sorry, what? And you get that signal long before it's ever an egregious offense, and we don't have, I think, the same resolution or granularity of communication, which is part of the problem. I think some of it is really thinking about how we create more space around the game to spend time together. And some of that is, this might sound like I'm kicking the can down the road, but some of that is actually to sort of allow humans to do what they do best, which is to evolve it. Right now, there's no space to evolve it because you jump into a game with a bunch of strangers, you play a game, we pop up a thing at the end that says, would you like to be friends? I mean, that's like, I don't know, you go play a soccer match, and then at the end, you walk up and you shake hands with somebody on the other team, you're like, would you be my friend? It's not really how we work. So we don't have any space around to allow these things to even evolve if they were going to. You can look at, I think, Minecraft and Roblox and other really interesting communities like that, where you see some of that social language kind of starting to form in those games, and how people have practices around that. And I think that there is some work being done in there. I think where we can surface more of that work would be really helpful to understand it. But I guess the short answer is, I don't think we know very well right now, but I also don't think as developers, we're trying to figure it out, and that's the real problem.
Time for about one more, I think. Yes.
Hi, thanks for your talk. When you were talking about matchmaking and helping people get into groups that more match with each other on a social level, do you think matchmaking based on something like intentionality per match would be beneficial?
I think if we could find a way to tap into that understanding, it could be very beneficial. I mentioned briefly we have a crude measure of that, which is picking a game mode, or picking whether you're going to do, I don't know, like a more casual mode or whatever. But I think that it tends to oversimplify and forces its own problems. Like, the phrase filthy casual, I mean, all of these things are reinforcing, I think, boundaries that are actually counterproductive to diversity and inclusion and these sorts of things. So I think we have tools in the form of bubbling up places where players can opt into things in a more meaningful way. But I think it first requires us rethinking what that means. Because the minute you make something a casual mode, or even smell like a casual mode, that's where people go who don't take the game seriously, or who don't play as well. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, here's game mode A, here's game mode B, here's game mode C. And maybe we do that by making there be competitive modes of all of them, or maybe we do away with competition, in some games, I don't know. But I think that's super, super important. And then I think we need to understand, we can't be forceful in this. I think of this concept of facilitated recognition. So we can bubble up things on behalf of players and give them the opportunity to say, didn't I talk to you at that time that I presented? And now I can see you over there. You're not being shoved in my face. It's like, you should be friends, you should be friends, you should be friends. But I can opt into maybe, do you want to play a game or something? And I think that actually comes at it from a different angle, where we're allowing players to self-select with the people that they want to spend time with. So it comes back, I'm broken recording it again, but it comes back to this idea, do you have more space? Do you have more opportunities for people to form connections? So we can hard code in, to a lesser extent, I think, different ways of surfacing to players what the kinds of experiences they're opting into, so it's their choice at that moment. And then I think we can create more space around the game itself for players to create connections ahead of those games and then opt to playing into those games. Because ultimately, we can't be friends with everyone, and I think sometimes as an industry, we think that's the solve. We really want to understand compatibility, and maybe you don't even want to have a friend. You just want to know you can go into a game and not be harassed or screamed at for screwing up. And so you're looking for a particular type of experience with folks that you trust, at least to that level.
All right, thank you, everybody. Let's give Kim one more big thank you for joining us.
Thank you.